And I'd like to move on to the next speaker from the Green Party, Deputy Matthews.
Thank you, Catherine, and I would like to thank the witnesses for their attendance here this afternoon and for the submissions you presented to us, and for the very important work that you do throughout society in terms of access to justice and equality, not just at this time but through all times. I have a question for Ms Barry, and thank you. Your submission was very detailed and it covered quite a lot of areas, and I only have 5 minutes, so I don't have time to ask questions on all the areas that you covered in it. But I want to ask you some questions in particular in relation to employment rights for workers during the pandemic. And I note that queries on employment law are up by almost 60% to your services, which is probably not unsurprising considering the upheaval in employment and impact on employers and employees during this time. But in your report you state that there's no legal obligation on employers to use a mandatory procedure in writing to place employees on layoff from their jobs, and to use a specific written procedure to notify employees that their layoffs was coming to an end and of the date when they would be expected to return to work. So is your contention that there's no legal basis to compel employers to inform employees of a layoff or the end of a layoff period in writing? Could you expand on that point, and what impact is that having on employees?
Yes. What is happening is that people are contacting us who have been laid off, in inverted commas, but who do not know how long they're going to be laid off and at what stage they'll be able to come back to work, and who are actually seeing colleagues return to work or people being appointed to their jobs. So there's this kind of layoff limbo going on in certain employment situations, I think, which is exacerbated by the lack of that legal requirement that we've set out to explicitly set out the length of time you will be on layoff. And there's also a problem because of the prohibition on people claiming redundancy sums. So they're in a situation where they may see colleagues returning to work, but they're not returning to work, and yet they cannot turn around and decide that they want to move on and claim what may be a very generous redundancy sum. So we feel that that's something that needs to be examined and reviewed, and so there is a lack of clarity around what are the legal obligations of an employer in this regard, but it is exacerbated by the inability of people to turn around and claim redundancy.
I agree with you that it is something that needs to be examined in certain types of employment.
It would obviously be private types of employment. We haven't seen any particular patterns, but no, we haven't seen any particular patterns in that regard. And
does it put employees at further risk of vulnerability in terms of employment law, the lack of this written document?
Well, it leaves them in a limbo in that they don't, they can't actually turn around and claim redundancy, and yet they're not. It requires them then to be in receipt of the payment, and they're not actually. They may be seeing colleagues returning to work.
Okay, thank you. On page 3, you talk about the benefit take-up campaign on rent supplement,
Yes.
the newly extended rent supplement scheme. You said there's very low uptake on it because not many people were aware that they may qualify under the new criteria. So there was a huge amount of schemes and supports and assistance being carried out across various different departments. Was this just one that was missed out on, do you think, and what lessons are to be learned from that?
Yes, I suppose we launched what we call a benefit take-up campaign because it came to our attention that there was actually very low take-up for it, but we also understood that people just didn't know about it, people who might be eligible for it, and that it was important that such a positive scheme from the department wasn't being utilised. And I suppose it goes back to our original point that people should have clarity about what is out there and what they may be entitled to, and perhaps encouraged to apply for as well.
And would you be satisfied generally that the awareness campaigns for a lot of the supports and assistances that were being carried out at the time, the awareness level was generally higher, or the campaigns to let people know that what was aware and what supports were there? Would you be generally satisfied with the way that was done?
Well, I suppose we were dissatisfied with how the changes to the eligibility requirements for the COVID PUP payment were achieved, in that, as we have set out in the submission, the website gov.ie, which the page which dealt with the PUP page, was changed. It would appear that the eligibility criteria were attempted to be changed simply by changing the criteria on the website, and we have set out our concerns in relation to the legality of the changes that were being introduced, but also the fact that when people were applying for the PUP payment, there was no indication that you'd need to be actively seeking work, or there was no indication that there'd be penalties imposed if you availed of holidays. So in that regard, I suppose we have concerns.
I just have one quick question on health and safety calls that you received, an increase in numbers on health and safety at work advice. Was that in relation to, was there a pattern in the types of employment that increase in calls came from?
It was from all types of employments, really, both public and private, and it would be from people who may belong to the high-risk categories and who were concerned about returning to work and hadn't been assured that or weren't assured that proper health and safety was being in place, or it may be people who had vulnerable people who they were living with and were concerned about, if they were returning to work, that they would in fact, on returning home, be put vulnerable relatives at risk. So it was right across the board. And what was particularly evident earlier in the year, when I suppose our employment laws peaked, were where employees were being told, come back to work now or you will lose your job, and that was a real concern.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Matthews. The next speaker is Deputy Smith from the Labour Party.
Thank you.